Hello, I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild Audio Podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it. In 2004, the investment bank and financial services firm Goldman Sachs came into possession of a group of distressed assets that included a 680,000-acre parcel of land at the bottom of South America. In part 2 of our celebration of the 20th anniversary of the establishment of Chile's Karukinka Natural Park, we dive into the extraordinary story of how Goldman Sachs came to gift this pristine landscape to WCS for conservation. Nat Moss has this report.
Back in 2004, Bob Christie was working in a group at Goldman Sachs known as Principal Finance Special Situation Investing. Among other deals, they looked at collateral-backed distressed assets, and around that time, they became aware of a portfolio in receivership that included 2 loans secured by pristine land destined for logging in Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America, 680,000 acres in Chile and another 180,000 acres in Argentina.
Argentina looked like a quilt. There was like acres here and acres there, and didn't really seem like it had a lot of environmental value. Where Chile is the holy grail. We were doing a roundtable, and we're like, what are we going to do with this loan? And one guy goes, well, we can always give it away. And we go, like, who would you give it to?
Bob pursued a meeting with Goldman chairman and CEO Hank Paulson with an eye toward protecting the forested territories represented by the loans.
I call Hank's office. I'm in his office 30 minutes later with these maps. And he doesn't know me from the doorman. I'm a pretty junior partner at this point in time. And, Hank's a pretty powerful personality. So I'm going in there thinking, okay, was this really smart? But I went in there and what I told him was basically, if we could buy the portfolio, we could put this into conservation. And how cool would that be?
Hank Paulson was very well known and accomplished and serious conservationist. And he asked the question of staff whether they could actually turn this into a conservation gift rather than trying to turn it into an asset.
That's Steve Sanderson, who was president and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society at the time. With the support of Paulson, Bob Christie's guys go into the bid and manage to successfully acquire the properties in Chile and Argentina. Now enter Larry Linden, whose long career at Goldman included the automation of their back office functions. He'd left the firm a few years earlier to pursue a passion for environmental protection.
I was sitting at my desk and I got a call from Hank, and I'd been retired from the firm for a couple of years. And Hank Paulson's calling. Okay, I thought, well, this is a novel thing. Doesn't call me up every day. And he and Bob and another leader of the firm, John Rogers, said, we have a great opportunity for you. Can you start like this afternoon? And to be honest, I was kind of annoyed. Like, do they think I'm sitting around with nothing to do? I'd already launched a whole other second career of working with World Wildlife Fund and others to save the planet. And so I said, well, no, I'm busy. So then I went down and told my wife, we just got a call from Hank Paulson. He wants me to do this. And I said, no. And she said, Larry, you're an idiot. Call him back and say yes. What a good wife does, right? So I called him back and I said, I accept, but there's one condition. You need to give me everything I asked for to make this successful. We need advice. We need a lot of travel. And they said, no problem. We're going to do all those things. And so basically I dropped everything else that I was doing for the next year and a half.
The most natural conservation group to turn over the land in Tierra del Fuego to might have seemed to be the Nature Conservancy, or TNC. Hank Paulson was not only the chair of Goldman, he was also the chair of TNC. But that turned out to be a problem. Again, here's Larry Linden.
We have these 2 loans in Argentina and Chile, and we're trying to figure out what to do with these pristine forests. We can't give this to the Nature Conservancy because our chairman is their chairman, and that would be a conflict of interest. So Hank and Bob and others turned to me and said, you got to help us find the right landing spot for this important forest.
Goldman engaged Norm Christensen, who was the founding dean of Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, to help. He spoke to the leading conservation organizations. As it happened, most passed on the opportunity. Here's then WCS President and CEO Steve Sanderson.
For a variety of reasons, some didn't want any part of it because they were not necessarily very oriented to on-the-ground activities, or they didn't have programs in Chile. or they didn't think, and this is really important, they didn't think that the high latitude landscapes were very important relative to the tropics.
For WCS, that concern about working in so-called high-latitude landscapes between 60 and 90 degrees in the northern and southern hemispheres was not an issue. Kent Redford, who had become intimately involved in the transfer of the land from Goldman to WCS as the head of strategy for WCS's international program, explains the thinking.
I was a big fan of the southern cone, as it's called, the southern portion of the South American continent, and particularly felt that it did not receive the proper attention from the conservation community, which was fixated on tropical rainforests. And with a couple of colleagues, we wrote an article called "There's More to Biodiversity Than the Tropical Rainforest," which made the case for why that part of the world was very important.
Kent's passion for the issue struck Larry Linden in particular.
I systematically went to the major conservation organizations, and WCS quickly emerged. And I talked to two senior WS folks, Kent Redford and Steve Sanderson, and Kent told me something about a phenomenon that he referred to as the tyranny of the tropics. So most biodiversity is in the tropics, as everybody who studies conservation knows. And way further south properties or further north can have a lot of great nature and big forests and so on. But being that it's a lot colder and in some respects drier, the number of species that are there that can be conserved is far fewer. And WCS had a great science program that saw this as a big bias in the whole conservation community.
Once WCS had been selected for the transfer of the land, Kent Redford was tasked by Steve Sanderson to go down to Tierra del Fuego to see the parcel for himself. He was overpowered by what he saw.
I had never been quite as far south as the island of Tierra del Fuego, although I'd been very close to it. And Goldman Sachs, they had a helicopter for us. So we flew over the land, and that was the first view I had of it. And it just absolutely drop dead stunning gorgeous. It was in April, so that's fall. And it had already started to snow on the higher elevations. And the peat bogs, which are the most glorious color of a blood orange. Then there are grasslands. So you have the greenish tan of the grasslands and this blood orange of the peat swamps with the forests and then snow on it and going down to the ocean. And you'd watch the waves lapping on the shore and see the glaciers in the distance. I mean, I don't know how anybody wouldn't just immediately say, fine, we'll take care of it for the rest of time, as long as we can.
Steve Sanderson joined them on some of these trips, and Larry recalls a very special bond that they forged.
They were great partners. First of all, they were fun to be with. The three of us spent probably a total of 2 weeks together in cabins down on Tierra del Fuego, trying to sort out what to do, meeting together with government officials, all that sort of thing. We were talking evenings around the campfire and so on. Steve was a great CEO of WCS. Kent was a brilliant intellectual and was widely admired.
One thing Kent could see immediately was the conservation value of the land they would be protecting, starting with the forest that remained intact and had previously been targeted for logging that characterized so much of the rest of the region.
Most of it had been turned into sheep grazing land. And so the fairly intact nature of the forests themselves was a key part. The fact that there were guanacos out in the grasslands and moving across this full range of ocean all the way up into the hills was a very important part of that because guanacos are hunted in many places and often confined to forests when they probably almost definitely weren't forest animals to start with. And the peat bogs. Peat is an extraordinarily carbon-rich environment, but peat bogs are also extraordinarily rich in biodiversity. And there already were peat mining operations going on very close to the property with the intention of extending the peat mining into what became the park itself.
WCS had decided to forego the Argentine parcel that Goldman acquired. That land would ultimately be sold by Goldman to create an endowment to help protect Karukinka in perpetuity. To fulfill the Chilean land transfer successfully required not only taking possession of the territory, but working cooperatively with the Chilean government, a government that had some reservations about private acquisition of large land parcels by people from outside of Chile. Here's Steve Sanderson.
We had to really work in Chile to explain what we were trying to do to the public, and we wanted to do that very transparently. So we did the acquisition with a lot of liaising with the government and with the private sector and with the nonprofit sector. And it's a complicated affair because every country in the world is pretty sick and tired of first world, if you want to call it that, organizations coming in and telling them just what they ought to do. And so there was that sensitivity in Chile. And Chile also did not have the kind of grand wildlife conservation tradition that some other countries did. So we wanted Chile to be front and center and not be running this thing out of New York.
Kent Redford expands on this idea.
We received advice almost from the first time we consulted anybody that our one objective should be not to behave the way that other U.S. environmentalists had been behaving towards Chile in terms of conservation. They had been purchasing very large pieces in the country and putting them to private reserves. And there was a very strong negative reaction from the scientific community, from the conservation community, and from the government. The sense of foreign intrusion was massive. And our objective was not to behave that way. So we didn't.
Kent and Steve were mindful of some of the mistrust that fellow American conservationists Doug and Kris Tompkins had experienced. Doug Tompkins, the founder of the North Face and the Esprit clothing line, had purchased with Kris a large amount of land in central Chile with the goal of protecting it. While the land they purchased was in fact protected and ultimately gifted back to the people of Chile as the Tompkins had promised, at the time of the Karukinka deal, they were perceived with suspicion. WCS Executive Vice President John Calvelli, who accompanied Kent, Steve, and Larry on some of these trips, says the caution WCS exercised at that time proved critical.
When we were down there, what we were trying to do was to really show a different approach. There had been concerns about private protected areas being created. There was this real worry that this area was going to be closed off because now it was owned by a private entity, and would it be available to the public? So we really went on an educational offensive. So we met not only with public officials, but we also met with many of the local media outlets, newspapers in Chile, and said to them, watch what we do. Give us a chance.
If you listened to our previous episode, you know that not only did the deal to transfer the land from Goldman to the Wildlife Conservation Society go through, but with the creation of the Karukinka Natural Park, work was set in motion for the creation of a highly successful Chile program at WCS led by Barbara Saavedra. John Calvelli remains very proud of how WCS threaded the needle to realize the extraordinary conservation opportunity that came to them from Goldman Sachs.
Look at Chile. It is a very long but narrow country. And there was this real concern that could private entities take over land and kind of cut the country in half? And we showed that what's most important is that we need to be transparent. How are we going to be dealing with the needs of this ecosystem? How are we going to be dealing with the local communities that are in the area around there? So it was a very complex set of concerns, but I really want to commend Goldman Sachs and the leadership of the Wildlife Conservation Society, specifically Steve Sanderson and Kent Redford, because we really were able to navigate those issues in a very, very constructive way.
To a person, those involved in the Karukinka deal describe it as career-defining.
For my part, it is the most successful thing I think I was involved in outside the United States. And emotionally, I just fell in love with the place the minute I set foot, and I already was just in love with Chile. And so it continues to hold a place in my life in ways that many, many other places just don't. And I'm sure most conservationists have a little file box of places they just love and places that they don't love quite as much. And this is it for me.
Kent Redford shares feelings similar to his friend and former boss.
There are a small handful of things that I would offer up to St. Peter if I ever get a chance to be asked a question about why I would be allowed into heaven. And one of those things is playing an important role in the establishment of Karukinka. So it's one of the things I'm proudest of.
Returning to the tyranny of the tropics theme, Kent argues that the overwhelming tropical hegemony that runs through present-day conservation thinking mistakenly suggests that places with more species are more important than places that have fewer species. That's a value, he says, not a fact. To drive home his point, Ken turns with a wry smile to the biblical narrative of Noah being tasked by God to collect animals for his ark.
It was 2 of each one. It's going to be mostly primates and dolphins and bats and flowering plants. It was 2 of each bloody one. And the conservation version of that is, if you save all the world's tropical forest and let everything else go to hell, you have not succeeded. And letting places like Karukinka, like the Southern Cone, like these extraordinarily gorgeous, but really honestly fairly species poor areas be of less significance is a moral sin as far as I'm concerned on the conservation community. So the tiny little bit I got to contribute to just nudge the scales to help make sure that through WCS and Goldman Sachs, this part of the world gets preserved at least for a while longer is an extraordinary issue of pride for me.
Former Goldman partner Bob Christie could not agree more.
There's nothing that's going to match it, period. At Goldman, 20-something years, built a highly successful business, had a group of really talented people, work with me on various transactions. We did a lot of really great work for clients. That was a great career. Being involved with this, it's mind-boggling. We assembled a group. We knew what we were doing, did all the valuations. We just had to buy the portfolio and then put it into safe hands. And I can't express adequate words to tell you how profoundly grateful I am that I got an opportunity to do this.
For his own part, Larry Linden reflects on how the Karukinka experience was unique in the field of conservation and for the way it altered the trajectory of his life.
It was one of the peak moments of my, now getting to be a long life. I'm really proud to work with Bob and Hank and a couple of other folks there to do it. I was incredibly grateful to the firm for the opportunity and the backing that I got, which was extraordinary in the field of conservation, which is always struggling to fund itself. And I built a set of skills and experience and self-confidence in doing forest deals, which I then spent most of my time on for the next 7 or 8 years. So I couldn't have done that without this episode behind me. So my wife was right when she said, "Larry, you're an idiot. Call Hank back." She was so right.
To learn more about how the Karukinka Natural Park evolved in Chilean Tierra del Fuego over its first 2 decades, check out our previous episode. For WCS Wild Audio, this is Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Hannah Kaplan and Dan Rosen. The WCS Wild Audio podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Please join us next week for a new episode, and don't forget to rate or review the show wherever you get your podcast.